Good afternoon, everyone. I have to thank Mohammed for such a good introduction for a number of reasons. So firstly, I work in a research team, and the goal of our research team at Google is to really understand the consumer and know how the consumer is starting to use all of the amazing new technologies that exist in the world. And what I do with that information is go out to all the advertisers and people around the world to help understand how they can make use of all of these new amazing technologies as part of their business. So what can we as marketers do to make that happen? The second reason that I have to thank Mohammed is that actually before joining Google, I trained as a neurosurgeon, believe it or not. So the analogy of the brain and all of the technologies being aspects of the brain is a very apt one. So with that, I'll jump in, and a lot of these trends have been nicely introduced. So I'm going to focus on what are the implications for us in the room, and how can we really act on some of the changes that we've seen. So firstly, the World Wide Web, as we know it, is now 20 years old. So this August was a celebration of when Tim Berners-Lee and others created the protocol that lets us go and look at web pages. And for those of you who weren't online back then, this was the entire internet, this page that you see behind me. And this was the full experience. And from here, this is Tim Berners-Lee, his homepage. From this, we've evolved into a world of HTML5, of gadgets, of apps, and all of these different ways to interact with content. So the question is, what influence is that having on the consumer? And then what does that mean for businesses down the road? So I want to take us back to 1993. This is a bit later than the Apple ad that we watched earlier, to take a look at the vision of the future at that time. And then from that, we can dive into the main topics of the day.
Have you ever borrowed a book from thousands of miles away, across the country,
Gesture ahead, take next step,
without stopping for directions,
route 101,
or sent someone a fax? From the beach, you will. And the company that'll bring it to you, AT&T.
So this is interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, most of those technologies actually happened. Secondly, AT&T wasn't responsible for any of them. But what I think is interesting about this is it's very easy to dream about the future and to predict what some of the new technologies are going to be. But actually, it's about empowering an ecosystem, empowering consumers, empowering brands to get out there and to really push and challenge the current ecosystem that makes all of this a reality and not just a vision. So that's really the context of what these changes are underlying. So firstly, the first rule of digital is that these new technologies are empowering consumers. We've already seen some of these stats earlier. So there's a lot of people online globally, and there's a lot of people who have mobile phones. But what I want to look at further is of these consumers with phones, let's take a look at how it's really changed their lives and changed the opportunity that businesses have to interact with them. So for those of us who are working in emerging markets, I myself am supporting Asia, so there's a lot of growth happening in that region. More than half of global internet users are coming from emerging markets. So that's something that you might be very well familiar with. But if you're sitting in the US or in the UK or elsewhere, it's something that often slips your mind, that all of the growth and a lot of the interesting things are happening in emerging markets. In the mobile space, this was the first device, the Motorola Dynatac 8000X. It weighed about 1.5 kilos, and it had very few customers. So it's another example of, here's a technology, but let's inspire people to give them the vision, to use it, to interact with it, and see where it goes. So we have all these numbers, 1,500 new customers a minute, all this new stuff happening. As Mohammed took you through, there's all of these technologies that now there are more of phones than there are of the technology. So what does it imply? Well, when you think of credit cards, as an example, it's a logical step that if everyone has a phone and no one has a credit card, or very few people have a credit card, shouldn't your phone be your credit card? And the answer is, of course, yes. You see things like Google Wallet and other technologies being developed that say a phone is a perfect way to get people to make payments globally. And in fact, it's emerging markets like Africa that are really taking the lead with mobile payments. So you have M-Pesa, which allows people to text money back and forth. Radio and other things are similar. To reflect on the last point that Mohammed mentioned in India, I have personal experience being in the market that you see someone talking on a phone while using the toilet on the railroad tracks somewhere in the country. Now, okay, that is a sign of depravity in some instances, but actually to me it also highlights the relative importance of having that phone. Someone would rather spend a couple $100s to get connected and to have a telephone and to use it than they would potentially doing something else. It's a necessity that you have to have. And when we think about ourselves with our phone, can you name a device or even a person who spends as much time in contact with you as that device does? The typical thought experiment is if I said, everyone take out your phone and hold it up, you'd gladly do so. But if I said, give it to the person next to you and let them hold it for the rest of this talk, that would make you really uncomfortable to think that this personal device was in someone else's hands. So what does all of this mean? Well, now we have an open ecosystem. We have Android, we have iPhone, we have all of these platforms by which this device is meaning people are connected to the internet in ways that they weren't before. And this leads to some interesting stats. So let's talk about a country like the Czech Republic. People in this country are 2.5 times as likely to buy a smartphone in the next 12 months than their counterparts in UK, France, Germany, or US. It's a pretty remarkable stat, particularly when already 1/4 of the population in this country has a smartphone. So we're going to see incredible levels of growth, and in a lot of cases, markets like Czech Republic will surpass a lot of their counterparts in terms of the level of penetration. And the reason is because this device gives a level of access and a level of capability that wasn't possible before. Another interesting stat is the second one. 1/3 of global consumption is coming from emerging markets. So you empower people, you give them tools, you give them devices, and then they go and they buy a lot of stuff, which is rather interesting for us. So the big question that I often talk about with advertisers is what role does the internet play in purchase? And here, this so-called ROPO effect, so research online, purchase offline, is actually massive. So in a country like the Czech Republic, approximately 70% of purchasers in some categories, so high consideration products especially, are using the internet at some point in their journey. And in particular product areas, so in retail or in technology, up to 50% of all purchases are actually made on the computer itself. So clearly giving the internet as a platform, having the growth in this region really empowers consumers to make decisions and to do things that they weren't able to do before. Okay, so the second rule, and this is one that I really like. Data is now sexy. So with all of this information being created, all the stuff out there in the world gives us a lot more potential and a lot more data to mine and to understand what consumers are doing. So, first example is the actual amount of digital information in the world. We spoke about this briefly, but when I started lining up all the zeros, this is a zettabyte of information, and that's how much stuff there is in the world. What's particularly interesting is that in 3 years, we're no longer going to have words to describe how big the amount of information is. So the scientists are going to have to go back and come up with the next, 3, 4, 5, 6 names to account for all of that information. But what I find particularly cool are some of the tools that can be used to harvest that and derive insight. So one of the modules that I work on with a lot of advertisers is looking at insights for search. Hopefully you guys have all tried this before, but it's a tool that lets you look at search volumes on Google for any term in the world, anything that you can think of in any of the languages that we support. So let's look at a particular example. So you can use this for actual academic purposes as well. This is the Recession from 2009, global number of queries for this particular term. And there's another search word shown in red that is almost exactly matching in terms of peaks and troughs with searches for recession. Any ideas what it could be? So it's lipstick. And if there's any economist in the room, what you'll know is that there's a lipstick theory of recession that says that when things are bad, more women search for lipstick because they're looking for a way to feel good, to look beautiful, and to go out and have a good time, even when they don't have as much money to spend on parties or clubs or meals or things as they used to. So it's interesting, and the data and insights for search actually show that it's true. Here's another example looking at Wimbledon. And this one, interestingly, is from Spain, because something very strange happened in Spain. In 2009, you'll see that there's a dramatic decrease in the amount of searches that are happening for Wimbledon. And interestingly, the reason is that their star, Nadal, pulled out of the tournament with an injury, and then people no longer care. It's an interesting insight into how consumers operate. So for me, the interesting part of this is how we as marketers can look to this data to help inform our decisions, to understand the consumers, to know what's happening, and to make interesting choices in campaigns off the back of it. One that you might be familiar with is the Google Search On campaigns. You might have seen some of these ads running in Czech Republic. This one behind me was the first one, showing queries from a man who goes to study in Paris, falls in love, and meets a wife. And what's really cool about it is it shows the power of this data, search data, to really tell a story of someone's life. And I think that level of insight is number one, beautiful, but number two, incredibly valuable. Because if we as marketers can really get in deep and really understand someone's motivations, then it's really great for developing products and for making sure that they work with those individuals. So rule number 3, again, one that has already been mentioned and is not going to be a surprise, but that's sharing is caring. And this is really the social space. But to me, what I find interesting is that everyone wants to say that there's one miracle solution to social. If you have a presence on one side in particular, then if it's Facebook or if it's Google Plus or if it's YouTube, then that's going to mean that you've solved it. But actually, that's not the case. Social is an ecosystem. It's a type of behavior. It's not a website. So really, we want to think about how social is playing out across the web. And here's a couple of stats. So 200 million blogs, about 800 million people on Facebook, which is incredibly impressive, and 48 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute. So there's a lot of stuff that's being created. And in fact, this constitutes 20% of the time, approximately, that people are spending on the web. So it's not just one site, but it's a whole behavior and it's a whole ecosystem. So what does this mean in terms of advertisers? Well, one of the first things that you see is that there's a desire to add a social layer to everything on the web. Here's an example from Germany. Grenada Pet, it's a pet food company, have these billboards where if you go and you check in outside of the billboard with your dog, it spits out some dog food from the billboard that the dog can then eat. So it's a way to add a social experience to something that's offline. Another example comes from Japan, which usually a solitary exercise using the toilet, but actually they've invented a social game that I think a picture is worth 1,000 words here, that lets you compete with others and play and do certain things in a social context that you couldn't do before. So it's all about adding this social layer. What's interesting, though, is that 1/3 of people are already claiming to feel overwhelmed by this. So the challenge for us as marketers is to say, okay, we want to be there, we want to communicate, we want to be a part of this space, but how do we do it while respecting people's time, respecting their privacy, and all of the things that they want from the experience? So that's something to consider. There's also this one, which is the challenge of, once everyone's on a social network, how do you filter it out? So to me, that's one of the things to keep in mind. Now another one is what's behind me now. Shocking when I found this out. 40% of people have liked competitor brands on Facebook. So if you're Coke or if you're Pepsi, if everyone likes you, what does that actually mean? The challenge is how can we build research tools, platforms, and other ways to engage to understand the value of what's happening here and to catalog that. And I'll get more into that in a second. Final example in the social space, this guy. You all know him, I'm sure. But what you might not know is that the reason this campaign ran with Old Spice and not with another brand is because it was a big risk. P&G came up with a brilliant idea, but they weren't sure about necessarily applying it to Ariel or any of the hero brands. And they said, well, let's pick an upstart. Let's do something small and scrappy and watch it grow. And this was really great. But the challenge is how do you do this across the whole portfolio of brands, the big brands as well as the small brands. Okay, so the final rule to touch on before I finish is really how to keep our jobs. Not such a rule, but a suggestion. And what that comes down to is proving the success of our advertising. So in the context of all of these changes, people being online with all these devices, everyone being social, there's all this data. What do we actually do? What it turns out is consumers have become very demanding. Because you empower them, suddenly they have a big voice, and you need to respect that voice. And the adage has always been, I know that half of my marketing works, but I don't know which half. Okay, so that's kind of the context. What I see as the major challenge is in most marketing departments, things are bucketed. You have a silo for digital, you have a silo for TV, you have a silo for all of these things, but there's not too many people able to connect all of those things together and look at the holistic view. So, proposal from Google and other people out there is that we start thinking about panels of users where for the first time you can measure their 360-degree activity and exposure to media. So you can look at their TV viewing, their web behavior, and their purchase history. Of course, it's voluntary, so they agree to participate. And you can understand across multiple campaigns what parts of the marketing mix are having the greatest effect. And this is an example from Germany. It's actually a synthesis of 92 cases run across the CPG category in Germany. And for the first time, we're able to have benchmarks across different media types of short-term ROI. So this is from one of these panels where you can say, okay, this person saw the TV ad 4 times, they saw the online banner ad 50 times, they clicked like on Facebook once, and then it lets you see, okay, what is the impact of my campaign? So you'll hear more about this later today from some Czech Republic-specific projects, but this holistic view of all marketing, breaking down barriers and silos in between them, is going to be the next big thing. And it's something that Google are very eager to partner with all of you in order to understand across the market. So I'll stop there because I'm out of time. But what I've hoped to share with you this morning or this afternoon, sorry, is how we can take some of these trends in technology, think about how it applies to our businesses, and then really form a strong partnership together to help solve these problems going forward. Thank you very much.